Creative Brain Candy by creators for creators.
You're listening to Simply Stogies, a podcast dedicated to the cigar enthusiast. Light up a stogie, sit back, relax, while James brings you along on his cigar journey. Simply Stogies will review cigars, discuss topics that cigar aficionados find important, sit down with guests from across the industry, and we'll probably learn a few things along the way. Now, here's your host of Simply Stogies, James.
Welcome to Simply Stogies. I am your host, James. This is part 2, a continuation of the first part of our conversation with Nick Syris about the history of Cuba. This is part of our Cuban sub-series that we'll be doing all year long here in the year of our Lord 2022. This episode, we discuss, we pick up where we left off after talking about Batista, and we're going to start with the one that we all know about, Fidel Castro and the revolution that happened in Cuba mid-century, last century. But before we do, we're going to have a word from one of our fellow podcasters on the Creative Brain Candy Network. And I want to invite you to go to OxfordCigarCompany.com, use coupon code Simply Stogies. That coupon code will get you 15% off your entire purchase. Doesn't matter what's in your cart. Use coupon code Simply Stogies and receive 15% off. And we'll return mid-conversation with Nick Syris, owner of LH Cigars, after this word from Creative Brain Candy.
Do you like true crime?
Oh my god, Kat, you can't just ask people if they like murder.
But I'm curious.
Well, curiosity killed the cat.
Does that make you Curiosity?
No, I'm Logan.
And I'm Kat. And we're the hosts of the true crime comedy podcast, Spoiler They Die.
One of us tells a story about a serial killer, a survivor, or basically anything morbid and scary. Also, we're Canadian, in case that matters to anyone.
I don't think people listen to podcasts based on people being Canadian or not.
People in our Discord server seem to care.
Oh, sorry about that, eh? But thanks for listening to us panhandle.
I'm Logan, and I approve this message.
These people know nothing, or they've been subjected. I don't want to make it sound like they know nothing but violence. They've just been subjected to violence and corruption since its inception. And this revolution that we're going to talk about here for a few minutes, it is no different with Fidel Castro. So let's talk about the rise of Castro.
Well, Batista, the U.S. government, as I mentioned, was really a big backer of Batista. The country was flourishing. I mean, yeah, was he super corrupt? Was he a badass dictator that everybody hated? Absolutely. And I mean everybody hated. But the country was doing so well economically that Batista felt, like he could just do no wrong and that the people loved him. But they didn't, of course. And a certain rebel leader by the name of Fidel Castro in 1953 stages a failed coup. Now, this, led to a total unsuccessful revolt against Batista. Castro is put in jail. And this is where he really screwed up.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was just so cocky thinking, man, you know what? The people have to love me, man. Everything is going great. The country just was flush with cash. At least the aristocrats were. Then it's the only people that mattered to him. That he thought, they love me. There's nothing going to happen. So a lot of people were calling for Fidel and other rebels to be released in prison because there was a lot of these little uprisings and they were quickly squashed by the very, very harsh rule of the military. So he thought he would do something nice and he lets Fidel Castro out.
Whoops.
So Castro, yeah, that's a big oops. Castro takes off, goes to Mexico, and begins immediately trying to come up with another coup to take over the country. So he goes there, he meets, his big buddy, another big name in the revolution of Ernesto Che Guevara. And so he wages what becomes a guerrilla war for 6+ years against this dictatorship. And everything, it was a tough war. And really what the turning point was, and I know a lot of the Cuban Americans are probably not going to want to hear this, but at the same time, they know it's true. What really was the turning point wasn't really that Fidel was doing so well. Fidel was just one of the little groups that there was a whole bunch of them that were like all these big leaders of these little guerrilla, military groups all over in the mountains and everything. And he just was one of many. And he was even one of the biggest. And they all kind of just did their little war. But the big thing was in 1958, the U.S. decides to just basically withdraw military aid to Batista. So now Batista's not getting his guns from the U.S. And before you know it, the rebels are winning. Winning so much that after 6 years, they basically take over. He leads a 9,000 strong guerrilla army into and takes control of Havana in 1959. That was the turning point.
Yep.
Castro makes himself prime minister. His brother Raul becomes the deputy, and Guevara becomes the third in command. Guevara being the only person, another little tidbit of information, the only way to get a Cuban passport in Cuba is being born in Cuba. The only person that was not born in Cuba that had a Cuban passport was Che Guevara. So it's like one of those, trivia questions. That's the only guy that had one. He was the treasury, the head of treasury. His face was, out there. And in a lot of ways, he was more popular and loved than Fidel, which didn't sit too well with Fidel. Fidel was quick to, a lot of things happened over the years, but, Camilo, one of his other top captains, lieutenants, generals, I guess was his official title, his plane disappears. He becomes a martyr. Che realizes that, I better leave because this island ain't big enough for the two of us. He goes on to his guerrilla wars, and there's all kinds of rumors and things about what happened to him. Movies made, fantastic stuff that leads to the imagination to think all kinds of things. But yeah, people pretty much know what happened. But anyway,
right.
Castro becomes, he gains control of the country. Batista leaves. I remember, not that I was alive then, but on New Year's Eve, 1958 is when he left. As soon as he left, that was it. He took over the country. Yeah. He established, the new republic. And, that was a big turning point because at that point, a lot of the Cubans saw the writing on the wall where they originally, I think most Cubans, including a lot of the exiled, self-exiled Cuban Americans, really thought that Castro was going to be, do the right thing by the country. And I believe maybe initially, maybe he did want to do the right thing, because he was against everything that Batista was what he represented, which was being a very harsh, dictator and corrupt and everything else. And when he finally got the reins, I think he said, well, you know what? I don't know. Maybe it's, why should I not do the same? Now, he would never say that, of course, or the Cuban government, but clearly he lined his pockets first.
Not only did he line his pockets first, but he became just as cruel, if not more so, than Batista. I mean,
absolutely.
So
absolutely,
I think it was more of for Castro. It was this is how I'm going to get into power. I am going to charm the people while fighting in their name against this regime, but then I'm going to have power. And I'll do the same thing, except now it'll be me because I am the working class. I am the lower class. And now I will be the upper class and I will have control and I will do this and I will have everybody else under my thumb and I will make it the paradise that I want it to be. And not so much what the people want, but he did give the people what they want. I mean, that is the harsh reality of it. The people wanted out from under Batista. They wanted less U.S. influence. They wanted to be more independent. Well, I mean, Castro checked all those boxes.
He absolutely did. And I'd like to believe, now you say maybe he had the plan all along. I'd like to believe that he went in with the right idea.
Sure.
Because, there's a phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe he had the right intentions.
I think you
let's give him the credit of the doubt.
You have more faith in humanity than I do. I feel, I'll concede the point to you because you're the Cuban expert. Like if you think he had that, then all right, sure. I don't think he did.
I do believe anytime you go to war, anytime you fight, you have to really believe in your cause. I don't think he's thinking, oh man, when I'm done, I'm going to own this country and I'm going to be super rich and I'm just going to be the ruler of this. I don't believe to be able to fight and to be able to convey either that or he's the best salesman in the world.
I think that's
well.
It. I think that, and I want you to think about some of the most prolific and most famous dictators in history. They're all very eloquent. And they are all very passionate and they all believe in what they're selling their people. And in Hitler's case, that led to a very specific outcome. With Fidel Castro, it's no different. Manuel Noriega. I mean, the list goes on and on and on as far as dictators and what they have done. And they are always fast-talking, sweet-talking charmers that tell the people exactly what it is they want to hear when they're coming to power. But when they actually get that power, it is literally on a dime, things change.
Well, all of the people you mentioned were pretty transparent from the get-go, I think. And look, you're probably 100% right. He became a violent and worse in so many ways than Batista, as he just took no prisoners and just made sure that he was the power and he ruled that country for so many years with an iron fist. But to get in there, with the ideals, a lot of people, I don't know. I'd like to believe that people
want to be good. Yeah.
Yeah. Are want to be good. Now there are just evil men in the world and Hitler comes to mind right away. But there has to be something in their brain that triggers them to become so evil. And maybe they're not born. I mean, if there's everything's not black and white.
No, you're right. Everything's not black and white. There's certainly shades of gray in there. But I mean, when you're talking about some of the most vile, reprehensible people on the planet that have done some of the most disgusting things to their fellow humans, I mean, Fidel Castro's pretty high up on that list.
He is. I mean, he's committed a lot of bad things, man. Bad things. I mean, I've done a lot of reading and here's the part that really, that I struggle with. I've met people in Cuba and, nobody will talk or say a bad thing about Fidel. Heck, they won't even say his name. Yeah. They fear him so much for many years, and I'm talking up until recently, they will not even say his name. They call him the bearded one, or they'll make this symbol of taking your fingers and just passing it around your chin, and that represents the bearded one. They won't even say the bearded one. That's how feared he was. But his ideas, he did dupe them. I think inherently communism is the only place it's good is on paper, where it doesn't work. No. And clearly it doesn't work. But yet, the idea of a utopia where everybody is equal is
it's a nice thought.
It doesn't work. It's a thought that will never happen, in among human beings.
No.
It will not happen. But yeah, he was there. He was a really bad guy. But he ran that country, and now I'll go on to talk about Fidel's rule. So he gets in, he establishes himself as prime minister. A week after he's in power, U.S. actually recognizes Cuba and Fidel's new government. But in that time, in the first, since 1959 up until the early 90s, an estimated 1.2 million Cubans fled to the United States. I mean, as soon as he got power, the people with money, they
knew.
They left.
They
left. Well, he literally, what he did is everybody that lived there, he emptied everybody's bank account and left, I forgot what the amount was, like $800. And you could add $10,000, $50,000, $1 million, and you were left $800 or whatever that amount. I could be wrong on that amount, but it was some very, very small amount. So he emptied everybody's bank accounts. He basically then reappropriated all the land, all the properties, and he started with his own family farm, in the countryside, just to show the country, look, I'm even taking my own property away, so to speak. And so he took over the country and everything there without payment. Now, he did offer to pay for the U.S. businesses that he reappropriated, but the U.S. government wouldn't allow that.
No, that would be legitimizing his government.
Well, we did legitimize his government. We did. We officially recognized him the U.S. officially recognized Castro.
When? Early on?
1959. Absolutely. Actually a month after he became prime minister. He came to the U.S. shortly after, came in front of the UN, the whole bit. There's video of that.
So he did his best to pretty much snow like everybody.
Oh, absolutely. He came in. The U.S. government's like, all right, we'll warm up to this guy. We'll make him our new patsy. But he didn't give in, you see. Same thing with the mob. The mob said, all right, just another guy. We'll just, they tried to say, okay, so here's the deal. This was the cut. This is what Batista got every week. We'll give you, what do you need? We just want to continue going. And basically, Fidel said, look, you have 48 hours to get off my island. And they're like, ha, ha, ha. And you know what? He won.
Yeah.
The mob was gone. He banned all casinos. I mean, you got to think back in those days, casinos, prostitution, and it was just, it was rampant. So
every trap you can think of in Vegas was there in Cuba.
Well, they were there because they were the Vegas, like I said, before they were Vegas.
Yep.
Now, we were all for it until the U.S. government realized, oh, wow, this guy isn't going to play ball. We got to do something about it. So then the U.S. started to try to figure out a way to do business. First of all, 1961, a short 2 years after he took over, the U.S. broke off all diplomatic relations with Havana. Why? Because the first thing Castro did, once he realized the U.S. wasn't going to play ball and they weren't being nice, they said, well, they could come in any day and just take me over. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak. Yep. So he went to the Soviet Union and said, listen, big brother, these guys are going to take me over in the blink of an eye if you don't help me. So the Soviet Union said, hey, why not? We'll have a part of Russia right 90 miles off the shore of the U.S. And so as Castro warmed up to the Soviet Union, the U.S. went the complete other way and was looking for a way diplomatically at first and somewhat politically to try to take back Cuba.
Yep.
Now, we had a lot of exiled Cubans in Miami and wherever. And so then the project, the big thing that was known as the Bay of Pigs, started after Castro proclaimed Cuba a communist state and his big allies. So after they tried to overthrow him with the Bay of Pigs, which was a very, you could read books on that chapter. It's a very, very in-depth thing. According to CIA internal documents, there was over 1,500 CIA trained Cuban exiles that failed in their invasion, and 1,200 of them were taken prisoner.
Yeah.
Now, they got tipped off, and he used that embarrassing moment to call for the Cuban people to defend the revolution because he just kicked the U.S.'s ass.
Yeah, and not just that. Now he can, I was just going to say, like, he can now proclaim to the heavens, I have beaten the United States.
And that's what he did. And he knew they were coming. Some way, somehow he knew. And we were not allowed to do, at the time, this is all under Kennedy. And there's a great movie I watched. I think it was called 13 Days or something like that. I forgot what the name. It was a really good movie. But anyway, it talked all about the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything that happened. The Bay of Pigs, when we were there, we were supposed to invade and do our thing backed by the U.S. government. Okay. It was supposed to look like it was only these exiled, Cuban Americans that were trained in Nicaragua that took back their country, and the U.S. had nothing to do with it. It was all for, but of course, not only did it fail miserably, but everybody knew that the U.S. was behind it. But we didn't, we were and we weren't. We were there. We had a battleship sitting so many, miles off the coast watching, these guys getting slaughtered and basically captured. And they said to Kennedy, do we go in? What do we do here? And he basically said, stand down. And we didn't go in. Now, if we had really gone in full force U.S. military, forget about it.
Yeah, I think if that would have you would have been looking at thermonuclear war. I mean, at that point, it would have been worldwide destruction all the way around. I honestly think Kennedy made the right decision at the expense of the Cuban people.
But you have to understand that during that time, and there's a lot of great books that were written, and some conspiracy theories, some not so much. A lot of these documents have come open. I spent a number of years reading a lot of the stuff during the Kennedy years. One of my favorite books was called A Legacy of Secrecy. And that basically talked about how Kennedy was working with the Kennedy brothers were working with the number 3 in command of Castro's government, and how he was going to overthrow Castro and we were going to take it over. And that's all. It's a fascinating story, and that would take an hour in of itself to explain. But it was very, very cool. And the book tells, just the prologue of the book basically explains it. The bottom line is that the mafia was behind that failed attempt and behind the assassination of
Kennedy.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories. And, I've talked to a lot of people, and I guess they just released a bunch more of these documents not too long ago.
There's as soon as a certain person dies, and I don't remember the name of the gentleman. He was in the government at one point, and then he was a pundit at one point, and I don't think he's passed yet. But as soon as that happens, there's supposedly a lot of documents that are going to be able to be released. So I guess we'll see. But I mean, who knows? But so the Cold War goes on, right? The Bay of Pig fails. We embargo. We put the embargo on Cuba, and that's been in place now since the 60s.
Well, wait a minute. Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis is what really ignited everything. Fearing the U.S. invasion, Castro then really gave the USSR carte blanche to basically deploy nuclear missiles to the island, which is what started the whole, Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, movies about that and books, countless books. But the crisis really was just resolved, let's say, when the USSR agreed to remove the missiles in return for the U.S. Removal of the nuclear missiles from Turkey. So that kind of put things on ice for a while after these, tense negotiations, and they kind of moved forward at the UN meeting, and everything since then was kind of status quo. But 1965, Cuba's political party was renamed the Cuban Communist Party because it wanted to more officially align with the USSR, since it was really modeled after their political party. They became such good buddies with Castro became like best buddy pals with Russia from 65 all through 70s and 80s. Cuba was like their best friend. And in fact, they started helping in the 70s, like from 76 through the 80s. Cuba starts sending all these troops all over Africa and helping all of Russia's little wars and backed ideas. They were there in Angola. When they were against South Africa and Ethiopia when they wanted to defeat the Somalians.
And that reminds me of something that you said on a previous podcast where we talked a little bit about Cuba, was that the main export of Cuba is its people.
Absolutely. To this day, in so many ways, the way they make a lot of money. Well, right now, if you look at the GDP of Cuba, number one was always remittance back from relatives that left. But the biggest export is their people. They just have lots of people, and they fought a lot of wars all over Africa, different countries. So yeah, that's what they used. They used their resource, which was people. In return, you have to understand, they received $4 to $6 billion a year in, help, from the USSR. They needed that money. Now, until we're going to talk about the next period, which is the special period. But just to finish up between the 70s, 80s, some other important key dates: 1980, 125,000 Cubans. Many of them were just convicts that were released. The Mariel boat lift, and Castro got pissed. Everybody was trying to leave, and he said, "You know what? Screw it. You want to go to the U.S.?" He loaded a boat up, emptied his prisons, and anybody else who wanted to get on that boat,
yep.
And boom, go to the U.S. And I've done movies and books about that. A lot of those people got thrown back. They got thrown back to Cuba. I met a guy there who was one of the most honest guys I met one of my first years there. And I was talking to him, and he spoke English perfectly, but he looked very Cuban. I said, "Hey, how do you speak English so well?" And he said, "Well, I lived in the U.S. for a number of years." I go, "And you came back?" And he's like, "Well, I kind of got thrown back." And he was honest. He goes, "I was there. I was part of the Mariel. I was doing some stuff. I got locked up. And after I got locked up, they threw me back here, and here I am." So the U.S. got rid of a lot of them, but a lot of things started happening in the 80s. And Cuba tried to survive, with the USSR, and that was they were doing fine. They showed their support with their troops, and they showed their support to the little guys. Yeah. That was their whole thing. They supported Argentina with their dispute over Britain with the Falkland Islands. They did all kinds of stuff like that. But the bad part was, how do you survive without getting that $4 to $6 billion?
I was just going to say, once the Soviet Union crumbled and the wall came down, like that was it. Like Cuba's days have been, at least in my mind, the communist regime's days have been numbered since then. And honestly, I'm shocked that they've made it this long.
Well, somebody always keeps stepping to take that place. USSR, once they stepped away, the period known as the special period, and they call it the special period mainly because of their extreme economic struggles that they went through and endured. There were severe, major shortages of fuel, paper, and food. Electricity was limited, like 4 hours a day. And even until 1993, Cubans were not even allowed to own or use U.S. dollars. They weren't even allowed to be in possession. If you were in possession of a dollar, you could be thrown in prison. I remember how scared they were. And that's not too long ago, Yeah. But anyway, after the 91 collapse, the U.S. tightened its embargo on Cuba in 93. They smelled blood. The U.S. said, boy, we're going to win here. Now they don't have Russia. They tightened their embargo. There were some market reforms that were put in place to help, to deteriorate their economy, but didn't work. What Fidel did is he legalized the U.S. dollar, and he transformed a lot of the state farms into semi-autonomous cooperatives, which are still in play to this day. And we'll talk about during the Cuba tobacco part, because that has a big play there. And another big thing they started to legalize private enterprise at some point. Remember, communist doesn't really work so well with entrepreneurs and capitalism.
Right.
But what you have there now is a total hybrid of that. So they were allowing certain private enterprises, certain casa particulares, which was renting of your houses, which was paladars, or these little restaurants. So basically, you cook in your home and you could offer your food for money. Other small businesses. What they did then in 94 is Cuba signed an agreement with the U.S., which allowed the U.S. to take 20,000 Cubans a year from Cuba, because Cuba, they kind of looked the other way, and these people would just flee to this day in these, makeshift rafts and boats. Many of them killed in the war. They wanted to leave Cuba so bad because they had nothing to look forward to, starving in essence, where they were risking their lives to come to the U.S. And, we had the period of the wet foot, dry foot, but the U.S. tried to prevent some of these deaths and said, look, man, listen, if we just say we'll take 20,000 of your people, how's that sound? And Cuba said, okay, fine. And they established this lottery system. The problem was people were so fearful. I talked to families there that, they didn't even want to admit that they wanted to take the lottery or go in the lottery, because they thought it was like a ruse or a trap that, you want to leave Cuba,
right?
Death to
you.
So a lot of people were scared. So the lottery system, even though people took advantage of it, most people were scared to take advantage of it. But 96 was a big year. The Helms-Burton Act was established, and that was a permanent trade embargo. Before that, we had this embargo that was supposed to be a temporary thing that was signed by Kennedy, that was kind of solidified by Congress in 1996. And that really happened because it was more of a response to Cuba's shooting down of the 2 U.S. aircraft operated by Miami-based Cuban exiles. And that started a whole bunch of stuff. The 90s was kind of a bad time, man, for Cuba in a lot of ways. But 1998, Pope John Paul II visited Cuba, and that was a very promising and uplifting visit by him. Also, that same year, the U.S. eased some of the restrictions of being able to send money by relatives to Cubans, because prior to that, you couldn't even really visit. You had to you could visit like once a year if you had a relative. They were pretty strict about going to Cuba. 99, everybody probably remembers, Elian Gonzalez, it was in the news every day, especially if you lived in Florida during that time, which I did. That really was kind of a political thing that basically this child was picked up off the Florida coast when his boat with his mother and his stepfather, they were trying to escape, and the boat capsized. And then this big, huge campaign by a Miami-based Cuban exile began, trying to prevent Elian from rejoining his father in Cuba and wanting him to stay with the relatives in Miami. Ultimately, they gave him back in 2000. The courts.
In 2000, the court said that they had to take you back. And then there's this picture. I'll never forget this. There's a picture of an armed soldier basically inside the house with this little boy in his arms, because they're taking him out of the house to take him back to Cuba.
Yeah, and they used that as such a political thing in Cuba, and they acted like they won this big battle because they got him back. And yeah, it was sad, because you had a child that, was basically taken from his father. I'm sure his father didn't want to be there, but he, kind of stayed back while the mom and the kid went. But then, of course, he became Castro's political puppet. But anyway, the 2000s started with things started going, in my opinion, the right way for Cuba, and I think for the U.S. In 2000, the House of Representatives approved the sale of food and medicines to Cuba because, believe it or not, they needed it.
Yeah, they still do.
What I feel terrible about the Cuban people is that they are the victims, of all this, where, it's sad to see what they've gone through. And this embargo definitely hurt the people of Cuba. I don't think it hurt the government. Obviously, they're still, in some ways, in my opinion, it empowered him, it isolated him, and it allowed for his rule to continue. Well, and I think if you had opened
it, also it allowed his rule to continue because he's able to tell his people the truth. Like, the Americans are the ones who are doing this to you. The
Americans are the bad guys.
Yeah. They
are the cause of everything that's wrong.
So it gives them an antagonist other than the guy who's holding, his foot on their throat. It made no sense to me for this embargo to continue anymore. Like, once the Russia was gone, the Soviet Union was gone, and they were no longer giving them a ton of money. This embargo does nothing anymore but absolutely hurt and hold back the people of Cuba.
For the last couple decades, I believe it's done nothing but help the current regime.
Yeah.
I've seen such a change in so many ways with the onset of Americans visiting there, with which that's a whole nother thing. When they allowed internet in Cuba, which they were terrified of for good cause, because that will be their ultimate demise. Democracy will, I believe, prevail there, or a change in government at the very least, because people's eyes will be opened where you don't have this basic isolation from the rest of the world, with the only exception being the tourists that come to visit. And mainly, of course, those were only, the Europeans that would visit and the Canadians. And so they would get some little insight from there, but their television is completely censored. Basically the news is, hey man, you live in this utopia. Why do you care what's happening outside the rest of the world and all these bad things? Because you live in a place which is just fantastic and beautiful weather, and why you got everything you need. And of course it's not true, but that's the propaganda that was, and they blocked so many things, so the people were not told these things. But the people felt it. Believe me, they felt it when they didn't have food and the long lines, and there's a lot of things that were going on. So the 2000s, the Russians try to become more buddy with the Cubans again, because they realized, hey, we just kind of left them hanging, and now we might lose them because the U.S. is warming up. They're starting to allow sale of foods. There's other things happening here. We're going to have to start trying to boost our bilateral ties.
Yeah.
So Vladimir Putin goes there. He signs this whole thing. We're going to be nicey nice. But then at the same time, Russia's talking with the U.S. and then we're becoming friendly in the 2000s. And Cuba gets pissed because they shut down this base, the last base that they had, military base in Cuba, and they got pissed, but November 2001, U.S. exports food to Cuba for the first time after more than 40 years. And that really became because it was a humanitarian aid thing, because the Cuban government asked for help in the aftermath of Hurricane Michelle. But when the Russian military base in Cuba was shut down in 2002, things started not looking so good. In April, diplomatic crisis after the UN Human Rights Commission again criticizes Cubans' rights records. Lots of things, a lot of people in Europe were going against Cuba. Cuba is not looking very good. They started jailing dissidents. Lots of things happened there. Even the EU, they stopped halting. They halted all their visits, their official visits, that is, in protest for the country's human rights records. They're starting to get a lot of bad press, lots of bad press. So Castro gets pissed, and because in May of 2004, the U.S. adds more sanctions. They restrict the Cuban family visits, and more importantly, the cash remittance. That's big. And that just happened again under Trump, which really, really was big as well. So Castro, he fights back by imposing a 10% tax on all U.S. dollar peso conversions. And I know that all too well because basically the US dollar and what used to be the convertible Cuban peso was 1-to-1. And then you had a 10% FU tax that Castro implied. And then there was a 3% bank exchange fee. So you basically lost 13% every time you changed $1.
So you'd get 87 cents for every dollar.
Yes. Yep. And it was fixed. So you always knew what it was going to be. So every dollar exchange, you got 87 cents. January 2005, it resumed diplomatic contacts with the EU, which were frozen from 2003 because of this whole dissident crackdown. Then July of 2005, you had Hurricane Dennis, widespread destruction, 16 people dead. That was not good. Not good for Cuban tobacco crops as well. But then you start to see the downfall of President Fidel Castro. He starts undergoing different gastric surgeries and temporarily hands over control of the government to his brother. And then he starts not making a lot of appearances. He wasn't around for the 50th anniversary of his return to Cuba. So everybody's like, oh my God, there was rumors that Fidel was dead and because nobody had seen him. Lots of things were going on. He never made his Havana annual May Day parade.
Yep.
So they were starting to say, oh man, 2007, first time since 1959, the Revolution Day was celebrated without Fidel Castro. So people are talking big. And then finally, Castro himself reads in a letter on Cuban TV that he does not intend to cling to power indefinitely and that he plans on handing over the reins to his brother. 2008, Fidel Castro announces his retirement and his brother Raul Castro takes over as president. And I remember this time very well because this starts when I'm starting to be there. And I remember the speech and what he was saying. And I'm like, oh my God, could these things really happen? He said a lot of great things. He was going to do all these things. And then I think basically Fidel heard about it and said, no, you ain't going to do any of those things. Kind of slapped him on the hand because he was still running the show.
Yeah.
But he did remove some bans. One of the big bans was computers and ownership of mobile phones. Before that, you weren't allowed to own a mobile phone. I got my first Cuban chip in early 2009, and I had the same number since then. I think I lost it now because you have to keep it active, once within a year. And having not been there for over a year and a half, I think. But anyway, that's
right.
Scratch that from the podcast.
Gotcha.
It's not important, but it makes me remember my old number. But anyway, he some other things that he did that made a lot of impact. He basically announced that he was going to abandon the salary equality thing. Where basically you were going to be paid different salaries depending on your position. Whether you were a rocket scientist or, a street sweeper, you were basically paid the same thing. He changed all that. The salaries were still minimal, like you couldn't live on them anyway. But you have to understand that this was seen as a very radical departure, from the orthodox Marxist economic principles that have been observed there since 1959. So that was a big change. So the EU then lifts its own diplomatic sanctions and things start to get nicer. Now, in July of that same year, in an effort to boost Cuba's lagging food production and reduce their dependence on food imports, the government relaxes the restriction on the amount of land available to private farmers. That's a big move. However, again, I think it's more symbolic than anything else because they say, okay, you can have your land back. Now it's officially yours again, where before it was all Cuban. But tomorrow they can go back and say, you know what, we'll take that back. And they've done it, many times. So yeah, in name only, it's back in your name. You know
right.
what I mean? But they were trying to do anything to boost, Cuba's lagging food production. And they reduced their importance to all this extra, relief that they really needed. But then again, September of that year, another hurricane, Gustav, and then Ike, more storm, more damage. the most in Cuba's recorded history. Over 200,000 left homeless. And that's a big thing, because one thing I have to say, unfortunately, in this country where we have abundance of many things, we still have a problem with homelessness. But one thing in Cuba that I never saw homeless people. I mean, I saw homes that were not very nice, but at least they had a roof over their head one way or the other.
Right.
So that's a big thing, you know. But the other thing that happened, which started an ongoing to this day thing, is that this state oil company actually were estimating that there was over 20 billion barrels in offshore fields. And they started, now they have the Chinese there mining, you had the Russians mining, because they believe they have so much oil, in their area offshore that there'll be more money than they could possibly ever want. But basically, since Cuba stepped away, Venezuela kind of took its place, and they didn't give them cash because they didn't have cash, but they gave them a lot of oil with a deal between, before Maduro was Chavez. Chavez was giving them, I don't know how many millions of dollars in aid, because of oil. In return, Cuba was paying with 100,000 doctors that they would export. Yep. Again, people being the crop. And that went on for a long time. And under Maduro's rule, he continued it because I think he wanted some of that same whatever was going on there. People's pockets were definitely being lined on both sides. Look at what's happened with Venezuela today. But anyway.
And I'm afraid that that's what's going to happen to Cuba if change doesn't come.
Yeah, well, the big problem now, and it's a whole nother story, is the Chinese influence and how China has now stepped in, kind of taken place. They have a lot of money, they have power, and they seem to love Cuba as well, including their Cuban cigars. But if it's really up to the U.S. at this point to kind of, make it a big deal. Like, Trump, supported the exiles and the anti-Castro movements and the Cuban Americans that were anti-Castro. And that's great. I understand, you came to this country, everything was taken from your family, under harsh conditions. Your ancestors, your family was killed. Bad things happened to you. I understand. But I do believe the future of your country is at huge risk now because you have other parties at play, mainly the Chinese and other influences. And if the U.S. doesn't, I don't see how the U.S. can allow China to take over that country. And the reality is, if we don't do something about it, they will, because they now are giving them plenty of money. And they're not like all these other countries that have loaned money to Cuba and then, it's okay, guys, you're a third world country, we'll just kind of forego that. No, the Chinese don't believe that. They're not very forgiving. We will give you this money. Oh, what? You can't pay? All right, listen, we'll give you some extended terms, but that's the best we can do. Then we're going to have a serious talk. Well, that serious talk's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. And I just hope that we as an American people see that 90 miles off our shore, we cannot allow Russia nor China to be there. So we need to take a very, very big, important role in.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the strategic importance of Cuba shouldn't be understated, but at the same time, like I feel like Cuba needs to make the people, and we'll talk about them in the next episode, but the people of Cuba need to make that decision for themselves with no external influence.
Wait. Time out. The problem is the people of Cuba would greatly want that. They don't have a voice. But they have no voice.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like the people of Cuba need to make those decisions without any external influence of China or the external influence of the United States, and figure out what direction they want to go. I mean, I really do. And I don't, and what I mean by that is this, not forgetting the strategic importance of Cuba, but the people right now they're still under a communist regime. Like Raul is no longer, like, I don't mean to fast forward, but Raul's no longer in power. He stepped down. The Communist Party is still in power there. And until that changes, they're going to be chummy with China.
How do you see that changing?
The people have to make that change. It's going to have to be. Look, we saw a little bit of this last year.
And do you know what the aftermath of what happened last year?
I'm sure we're going to get into that in another podcast. It was not pretty.
Not pretty.
No, and I get that.
They want to get, but what needs to happen is what was continuing to happen with outside influence, with allowing Americans to travel freely, with allowing more free trade. That's going to make them want and desire and risk their lives more to get that freedom, which they so desperately want. But you have to understand, 2008, which is what we were last talking about, their economy collapsed. Their growth was nearly half to 4.3%. Things were just going bad. And then the Bush administration, they finally lifted the some of these restrictions that were put in by the Bushes, without sending money back. Now money's coming in. Now there's the other side of the coin that says when you send money, when you go there and you travel, I mean, there's a lot of people in this industry, meaning the cigar industry, that are very against anybody traveling to Cuba, and their reasoning, I understand it. It's like, okay, we don't want to put money in the government's pockets, but when you're there and you see it firsthand, when I go there, when I do my tours, and my tours are very anti-political, I make a point. I'm there for the Cuban people. Yeah. Support of the Cuban people is the exact title of what the license category is, because we're there to support the Cuban people by putting money into their pockets directly. Does it eventually funnel? Does it eventually all get back to the government? Yeah. Is it that when you fly on an airplane, there's taxes that are imposed and that feeds the government? Yes. Is the government getting money? Yes. But the people are getting money too. So when you starve the government. I
think more important than that, Nick, the people are getting exposure, like you said earlier.
That's the most important thing. That's I mean, the funniest thing is when the internet thing happened, I was talking to all the Chinese contractors that were there, they were setting the cables and doing the stuff. They had this cruise ship that was parked in the harbor there, and they worked there. They lived on this cruise ship, and they basically were wiring the whole country with internet, the infrastructure. And when they were finished, because I could talk about the internet there over, my personal experiences over the last 10 plus years. But when they finally put internet in, and, we had good internet over in Cuba, for 2 years, the Cuban government refused to turn the switch and turn it on because they were terrified. They didn't want to open Pandora's box. And they're right, because that is the problem. Now, they're not as restrictive, even though they do censor and restrict the internet there. Not as bad as Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, which I have a lot of experience with. And that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But yet we're like, hey, Saudi is great.
Yeah. Well, it's all about money, and it's all about what you can do for me now.
There's so many things we did against the Cuban people.
I agree.
And the Cuban government, because they can't offer us oil, they can't offer us money in those terms. It's very frustrating. And again, I don't want this to be political, and I don't want to sit there and talk in or against anything other than just, I feel terrible for the Cuban people, and they are the ones that are suffering there, and they are just people that need, and they're so close to us here in the U.S., and they're a very, very smart people, very hardworking. And I just think that they really could flourish if they had the right, things are changing there, but it's, there's a lot of new economic reforms, that have been going on over the last 10 years, but it's still not enough. Still not enough.
No. And I think, in the next episode, we're really going to look at the people of Cuba and hopefully give you folks a different perspective of the people of Cuba and a more personal perspective, because Nick, you have such a great history with them. Like you really do love the culture. You love them as a people. And so I think getting your perspective on the people of Cuba will help us kind of understand Cuban cigars, Cuban culture, and where they're at now. And obviously we just talked about where they've been.
All right. So we should wind this down, and we'll have to summarize. There's a whole nother chapter that happened basically, from the onset of the changes that went on. There's a lot of things that happened in the 2000s, the years that I were there. I know them personally. I could offer a lot of insights with some of the stuff there, but in a nutshell, basically after Raul took over, things started to change little by little. The rest of the world kind of embraced them more, started giving them more money. So our embargo doesn't have the same impact anyway. It hasn't for years.
Right.
So they're getting just about everything they want. Would it be easier to get it from the U.S.? Yeah, but there needs to be a reapproachment with the U.S. And things have started in 2014 in a very surprise development. Obama and Raul announced this, hey, we're going to normalize diplomatic relations that were separated or severed for 50 years. They established the embassy again. It was just an office of interest for the last 50 years. In 2015, it was January of 2015, Washington eased some of the travel and trade restrictions on Cuba. There was a lot of things that happened that in 2015 were the reopening of both embassies. There was that famous video news clip of Obama in Cuba with Raul.
Yep.
There was a lot of things, but you know what? Whether you're Republican or Democrat, the one thing I did like was that things were going the right way, in my opinion, of easing of the life for Cubans, and of course the other side says that no, it was worse, and we're allowing them to flourish, and I don't want to argue. I don't want to argue. I just want it to end. I just want them to be able to move on as a people, and it's just so sad that it's 90 miles, off our coast. A lot of things started happening. I even had a credit card from a U.S. bank that was authorized in Cuba.
Wow.
And that was great because, every time you had to go, you had to bring, wads of cash, and that was always a pain in the ass. And then the credit card was difficult at first because it wouldn't work, and it worked some places. And then, of course, that was cut off. So we've gone back a little bit, from the more open way that I thought it was progressing the right way. And after Fidel's death, in 2016, I thought, wow, things may start even getting better. But then Trump kind of overturned a lot of Obama's policy. And I think he did that for political reasons, because I know for a fact he had people over there looking for, for business reasons to be there. And some of the things that he changed, I mean, you had the Sheridan Corporation that opened up a hotel there, operating a hotel, and then Trump says, no more.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we just spent a few, okay. And it's like, man, I just saw things going in the direction of democracy.
Yeah.
People there were doing good things.
And you would imagine that now that Trump's, his administration's gone and we've got the Biden administration, which was, he was the vice president during Obama's administration. He hasn't overturned anything that Trump has done with Cuba.
Nothing. Well, the reason is I understand his caution, because right now there's a big problem with Venezuela. And another problem we're having, and a lot of people don't talk about it, with our industry, is Nicaragua. Potentially, the U.S. government, if they start doing some type of, can you imagine if they put some kind of sanctions on Nicaragua, what would happen to the tobacco? I don't want to give the government
any ideas, but if you want to really put a stranglehold on tobacco in the U.S., that's how you do it. Is you start putting sanctions on Nicaragua. And then literally the only places we could get, the tobacco is Costa Rica and Peru and Honduras, the Dominican. You would put a hurting on the tobacco economy if you did that.
Well, listen, it's not,
and it's not outside the realm of possibility, is it?
They don't talk about it much, but this is going to be an interesting year politically for Nicaragua. And, yeah, that would be bad for our industry. It would be bad for the people of Nicaragua. There's a lot of bad things that can come out of it. Would we, pivot like we did with Cuba? Yeah. I mean, Nicaragua has become very important to us. Probably become the most important to the American market, where it used to be the Dominican Republic. It would have to shift somewhere else. You have a lot of other countries there that can produce some really good tobacco. Ecuador, Honduras, there's some really other big countries that could step up more production. But you would see, that would put, just to bring it back to cigars for a minute, that would put a lot of companies in the position of having to change a lot of their blends, and a lot of the more popular blends here in the United States would overnight go away. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of companies would be devastated. Some of the biggest players now are all based in Nicaragua, and that would devastate them and this industry. Not to mention there'd be a huge shortage of tobacco.
And when you're dealing with things like sanctions, and it's all politically motivated, things like legislation, and the things that the PCA does and the CAA, like none of that matters, because it's just, they fucked up. This is how we're going to deal with their fuck up. And you're just kind of caught in the crossfire. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much longer you want to go, James. I thought this was going to be a 30-minute thing. I did too.
And, we have covered a lot, Nick. The history of Cuba from its inception to its modern history, and everything in between. And I think this is a good starting point. And I may, I may break this episode up into 2 episodes, because it was a lot. There's a lot of information. It was a lot of good information, and it gives us a good starting point. And next time, Nick, we're going to have you back, Professor Nick Syris. He's going to be the co-host for this Cuban series, and we're going to be talking about the Cuban people. And it'll probably be a little bit more cigar-centric as we go along on this series, guys. But episode 2 or 3, depending on if I break this episode up into 2, is going to be the People of Cuba, followed by the history of the Cuban cigars. And that's after that, the People of Cuba, we really start to dive into the Cuban cigars. But this, if you don't know the history of Cuba, how can you appreciate fully the cigars and the products that come out of Cuba? So, Nick Syris, I appreciate you taking the time today to give us all of your information, share your expertise with us.
Thank you. I love talking about Cuba, love talking about cigars, and there's a mic here, I will do it.
And you're going to do it again next month. So look forward to episode 2 of our series, the Cuban series, with Nick Syris of LH Cigars. That's going to do it for us for this episode. Join me next time, where you know exactly what we're going to be talking about in this series. It's going to be Cuban cigars, and we're going to have Nick Syris from LH Cigars with us. Until then, guys, stay smoky, friends.
Thank you for listening to Simply Stogies. Visit simplystogies.com for the latest articles and reviews. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest in video content, and please rate and review Simply Stogies on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. You can follow James on his cigar journey on Instagram at Simply Stogies Podcast, all one word, and on Twitter at the Twitter handle at Simply Stogies. If you have a question or suggestion for James, or would like to be on the show, please send an email to info@simplystogies.com. The views and opinions expressed by James and his guests are their own and do not reflect those of Creative Brain Candy or their affiliates.